Hi there, this is Kendall with Sager Family Farm, and today I wanted to answer the question, should I get a beehive? I get this question a lot, and so I wanted to answer some of the questions that come along with that is, can I put a beehive in my backyard? How much time is this going to take? How much does it cost to get started? I don't know anything about bees. Should I get my beehive? If you want to see more of my beekeeping videos, make sure to subscribe to my channel down below, and you'll see all of my great stuff about beehive components, what tools to get, and lots of other great topics. So I'm going to dive right in here and start talking about some of the reasons why maybe you're excited to start keeping bees. And I think the number one thing that comes to mind is honey. Most people are really excited to get honey when they start keeping their bees. And in your first year, you might not get a lot of honey. I have a really tiny beehive back behind me. The pink one might not make a lot of honey this year or any honey at all. And that is not uncommon. Our first goal in starting beekeeping is to get a really nice, healthy hive. So in the first year, they're going to grow really big. I also have this big hive behind me, and so they have been established for over a year, and they're starting out this spring really strong. And from that beehive, I'm expecting over 100 pounds of honey this year. So you get a lot of honey from just one beehive. So from 2 beehives in my backyard, I could get around 200 pounds of honey every year. So you definitely get honey, but you get a lot of other things too. So one thing that you also get as an offshoot of harvesting honey is beeswax. Beeswax can be used to make all sorts of stuff. You can make lip balm, you can make candles, lotion, you can even make furniture polish. So there's a lot of great stuff you can do with beeswax. You can also collect propolis, which is a resin type substance that the bees collect, and they use it as a natural antimicrobial. Humans can also use it as an antimicrobial, so you can make tinctures out of it, but it's also a beautiful color, so you can make wood stains from it as well. The pollen you can collect off of the bees' back legs as they enter the hive, and this is something you could use in a smoothie or on top of your yogurt. So there's a lot of products that come directly from the bees. Additionally, these kind of side things that you get is pollination. They're great little pollinators, and they don't need to be right next to your plants. You can see I've got a little plum tree right in front of them, but that's not like the best placement. They'll still go all around my yard into many of my neighbors' yards and pollinate a lot of plants. So they're fantastic little pollinators. And to boot, I just really like watching bees. So that's a main benefit for me is I find it really peaceful to open up a beehive, start looking inside, just seeing how they work together. So I have a ton of fun just beekeeping by itself. So there's a lot of great reasons to keep bees. So now let me go into some of the reasons why you might not want to keep bees, or maybe your spouse or family don't want you to keep bees. So some reasons not to keep bees. You might be having people saying like, oh, they're going to sting me. Bees don't naturally want to attack people. As you can see, I'm sitting fairly close to my own beehives. I can actually, I can touch this pink one back here. That's how close I am to this beehive. And you can see the bees coming and going around me. So these bees do not want to attack me and sting me. Having bees in my backyard, yes, there is an increased risk for stings. There are a lot of bees in your beehive, but as long as they're positioned correctly in your yard so that people who don't want to be in contact with them are not near them, and you keep your bees properly, so you make sure not to squish a ton of bees and that they're not constantly being bothered, bees don't naturally want to attack you. When a bee stings, she dies. So it's not in her best interest to do that. The only reason she wants to sting you is to protect her family. So all of the baby bees are inside of here. The mother bee, so the queen bee, is inside of here, and they will sting to protect them. So right now, I am not looking like a huge threat to those bees. I'm not wearing anything with heavy scents on it, so I'm not wearing perfume, a really smelly shampoo, anything like that. So the bees aren't attracted to me like I'm a flower. And I'm not wildly waving my hands and swatting bees. If I was doing that, I'm a pretty large animal compared to an itty bitty little bee, so they might view me as a threat. But the first thing they do generally is not sting me. So much like other animals, they give a warning. So if my cat was hissing at me, I'm not going to be like, oh, kitty, I'm going to pet you now. I'm going to say, this animal does not want me near it, and I'm going to give it its space. The bees have a similar kind of tactic. So the guard bees will come up and they can smell where your face is based off of your breath. And they will start tapping you in the face to say, back up. We do not want to fight you, animal. So they're trying to get me away from their house without having to sting me. If I don't listen to them, then they're going to sting me. And even though that bee dies, she's trying to tell me if I encounter another bee, maybe give it some space because it hurts to be around bees. My beehives are actually faced towards the fence, so I'm not sitting right in the entrance of the beehives right now. If I was sitting right in the entrance, I'm still, as long as I could remain calm, I still probably wouldn't get stung, but I would be covered in bees right now because they would be kind of bonking into me and saying like, why is this thing in front of our house? So I made sure to put my bees not near any major pathways so people can enter my house, can be in my backyard without being forced to interact with the bees. So that kind of covers the stinging aspect. So now let's jump into, I don't know anything about bees. So what are they doing? Do I need to feed them? So let me go over a few bee basics before we dive into some of the other logistics. So a little bit about the bees is inside of this hive, there are 3 different castes of bees. So the first one that most people probably know is the queen bee. There is one queen bee in one single hive, and she is the mother of the entire hive. So she's the only bee laying eggs and creating the babies that turn into worker bees. So she is pretty busy because inside of this hive, this orange one probably has about 40,000 bees in it right now, but at its peak, it will hit 60,000 bees. And that's probably gonna happen in the next month or 2. So this queen bee is busy. She could lay up to 2,000 eggs every single day. So that's why she probably needs some worker bees to help her out. So those 40, 60,000 bees that I'm talking about worker bees. So those are the bees that we see flying around me. So they're going out to collect nectar and pollen. So that's the food that the bees are eating. So when you see them on flowers, they are collecting both nectar and pollen to bring back to feed the other bees in the beehive. They're also feeding the queen bee. So the queen bee exclusively eats royal jelly, which is kind of like the milk of the beehive. It's a substance excreted by the young worker bees and fed to the baby bees and to the queen bee. So it's really nutritious. The worker bees are also grooming the queen. They're cleaning the inside of the beehive. If it's cold, they cuddle together to keep it warm. If it's hot, they spread out and fan their wings to ventilate the hive. If any bee dies inside of the hive, they actually remove it and they'll scatter it through the neighborhood so that there's not a pile of dead bees outside of your own hive. They don't want to attract predators here. So they are cleaning the area around their hive as well. So worker bees are doing a lot of different things inside of the hive. And a little worker bee, you might hear me use she a lot. All worker bees are female. So that's why I say she so much, is because most of the bees in here are girls. So, and those worker bees only live for 6 weeks. That's it. So they're very short-lived little critters. They spend the first half of their life doing inside chores, so taking care of babies, feeding the babies, cleaning the inside of the hive. And then they spend the last 3 weeks of their life outside collecting food. And these foragers will travel up to 5 miles from their house to get food and bring it back. So you don't have to have all of these blooming flowers in your yard just to have a beehive. They will be getting it from your neighborhood. And I find that in most suburban areas, there is a lot blooming because your neighbors want beautiful yards, they're irrigating their yards. So bees have a pretty easy time finding things to eat in the suburbs. The last caste of bee that I haven't mentioned is the drone bee. So the drone is the boy bee, and his only function is to mate. That is it. So there's about 200 males in the beehive during mating seasons. So spring, right now they're ramping up to get lots of male bees in order to breed colonies. So this is a natural like baby animal season. And that is all the boy bee does. So he's not guarding the beehive, he's not bringing in food, he is just for genetic diversity. So he is necessary, but that's why there's not as many of the male bee inside of the hive. So one queen bee, up to about 60,000 female worker bees, and about 200 male bees compose a beehive. So the next kind of connected question is, what does a beekeeper do to take care of bees? And I've got some linked videos down below about what kind of tools you need, all of the gear, all of the parts of the beehive that you'll need to buy, and I'll go into much more specifics. But you need some basic tools like a beekeeping suit and a smoker. But when I open up the beehive, I'm looking for a few basic things. The first thing, is my queen bee around and is she doing all right? The second thing is, how are my bees doing on space? Do they have too much space or too little space? So do I need to expand or contract the beehive? And then the third thing is a general health check. So those are my three basic things. Sometimes I do some other things, like sometimes I'm harvesting honey and have some other objectives. But in any inspection, those are the three things I'm trying to answer. So the first thing is, how's my queen doing? And I don't actually need to find my queen bee to do that. I'm actually looking for evidence of my queen bee. And the queen bee is the only bee that lays eggs in there, or at least eggs that turn into worker bees. So I'm looking for evidence of the queen by looking for babies. So if I see babies in my hive in all developmental stages, that's a really great sign. So if I see eggs, I actually know my queen has been around in the last 3 days, because a bee is only in an egg for 3 days before it hatches into a larva. So if I see the larva around, I know that my queen bee, based on the size of that larva, has been around in the last 3 to 9 days. So if I see big fat larvae, I know my queen bee was likely around to lay that egg 10 days ago. After the larval state is the pupa. So the bees go into a little cocoon, and these are capped, covered in wax. So if I see capped cocoons, so capped pupae in my hive, then I know my queen bee has been around in the last at least 21 days to lay that egg. So hopefully I see all developmental stages, and especially I'm looking for the smallest larvae and eggs to confirm that my queen bee has been around rather recently, because finding the queen amongst 60,000 bees can be a bit of a challenge, especially if you're a beginning beekeeper. So don't spend all your time trying to find the queen bee, because as you're looking through the hive and putting things back in, she is moving through the hive. So don't be stressed out about finding your queen bee. You can evaluate whether she's around and healthy just by looking at the baby bees. So the next thing is space. Do my bees need more space or less space? So since we're in springtime right now, we're in the my bees likely need more space time period. So I'm looking at my hive, and if my bees are covering up about 8 of the 10 frames inside, so they're taking up about 80% of the space that's inside of the hive, I'm going to give them an extra box to move into. Because in the springtime, the bees are bringing in lots of nectar, and they need a place to put it. So by giving them an extra box, they say, this house is large enough and I've got plenty of space to put things. If I don't give my bees space, I'm at risk for having my bees swarm. Swarming is when the queen bee leaves with half the bees and they go off and start a new hive, and then this hive here raises a new queen bee. So they basically divide in half. And that gives this hive more space, and then this beehive goes and creates a new hive somewhere else. So I want to make sure my bees have enough space, so I am reducing the chances of the bees swarming into another location. In the winter time, I'm actually kind of doing the opposite. So there's not as much nectar and not as many flowers blooming, so the bees don't need as much space. So the queen bee actually reduces how many eggs she's laying. and that reduces the number of bees in the hive. So as the bee colony shrinks, I want to make sure to shrink my colony with it, because if the bees aren't patrolling all of the space inside of their hive, then pests might move in. So there's wax moths, hive beetles, even mice can start living inside of the hive if the bees are not taking up and patrolling that space. So I want to make sure my beehive has exactly the right amount of space that the bees are using at the given time in that year. And the last thing that I'm looking for is a general health check. The thing that you should recognize as a beginning beekeeper is what looks kind of right and what looks kind of wrong. So you don't necessarily need to know what the disease is, because as a beginning beekeeper, hopefully you're connected in with a local beekeeping group that you can ask some questions about. So you can say, what's happening in my hive? So priority number one is just recognizing when things don't look quite right. Healthy bees look nice and fuzzy, beautiful, intact, whole wings that are overlapped on top of each other. The larvae should look nice and white and shiny and plump. The cappings should be nice and creating kind of like just a slight little puffed out dome. They should be a good color. Whereas if things are looking wrong, you might be seeing discolored larvae. You might be seeing kind of like shrunken, like goopy larvae. You might be seeing cappings on your hive that are sunken in, or maybe there's a slimy coating on the top. So there's definitely kind of like a this looks good and this looks bad sort of thing to it. So I want to make sure every time I'm in there, I see beautiful, healthy bees and not things that are a little alarming. And if they are, I want to make sure to try to remedy them. The next kind of connected question that I wanted to answer is, can I keep bees in my yard? And the answer is likely yes. So, and I'm just talking about how feasible it is to keep them in your space. I'll talk about the legality in a little bit. But how feasible is it? So my entire yard is 600 square feet. And in this yard, I've got 2 beehives. I have my chicken coop that you can actually see in the background right now that has 8 chickens. And the bottom of that chicken coop is actually a sheep shelter, so I have 2 miniature sheep. Additionally, I have some veggie beds. I have some vertical trellises to grow some of my veggies. So in 600 square feet, I have all of those things. So the bees don't need a lot of space. In order to utilize my small space and make sure it's not completely filled with bees, my beehives are actually pointed directly at this fence behind me, so that way their flight path is up and over the hives, and so I can sit really close to these beehives and not be in their direct flight path and be covered in bees. So it's really just about proper positioning of your beehives in your space. So you can keep them in relatively small yards. You can actually even keep them on the roof of a building if you have access to that roof and it's a nice flat roof and it can support the weight of a beehive. I actually keep bees on roofs. I keep them in fields at Philoli. I keep them in my backyard. I actually keep them in other people's backyards too. So I went online and asked a bunch of my neighbors, like, hey, I don't have enough space for more bees. Can I put some bees in your yard? And I actually got a really positive response to that. Now I want to talk about how much time is it going to take to be a beekeeper? So how much time am I going to spend inspecting the bees, harvesting honey, and things like that? And the answer is that it changes depending on where you are in the country and what time of year it is. So right now it is early March here in California, and so it has been spring weather for quite some time. So I started actively inspecting my beehives starting in late January when it hit 80 degrees here. So on nice days, I'm definitely making sure to open up my beehives. That being said, in the high season, or spring, starting in January here, I check my bees at minimum every 2 weeks because they could be running out of space quickly. So starting in late January, every 2 weeks, I'm going to spend about 1 to 2 hours inspecting my 2 beehives. So for a single beehive, I would expect to spend ballpark about an hour getting my suit on, opening up the hive, looking around, and that's every 2 weeks. So you can do that on a weekend. They don't need necessarily to be a weekday hobby, so it's very easy to keep bees just on the weekends. As we get further into the summer and there's less nectar available, so in California here it gets hotter, drier, so the bees tend to level off. So they're not growing quite as quickly. So I might be able to slow down to every 3 to 4 weeks. And especially if I'm going away on a vacation or something like that, I make sure to check my hives right before I leave and then right as I come back. And then I could leave for about a month in July. And then in the fall, so as it gets a little cooler, I've finished harvesting honey. I expect to spend about an hour every 3 to 4 weeks as well. So if it's a nice day, I try to pop in there and see what's going on. And then in the winter, so that's usually when there's rain here in California, so the bees are staying inside a little more. If there is a nice day, I'll pop in there, but sometimes I will leave some of my beehives from like middle of November until middle of January. So I can take up to 8 weeks off, and I don't really need to look at my beehives. That being said, I'm usually looking at them from the outside to make sure on a sunny, windless day, the bees are still coming and going. Again, if you live in another part of the country outside of California where there's snow, your winter is going to be a lot longer. So there's several months where you don't need to do anything. So in California, we're a little bit more hands-on because our bees are more active throughout the season. So if you're reading beginning beekeeping books, definitely make sure to take climate into account when they say like, oh, you don't need to open your beehives until April. That's a very bad idea in California. We've had spring for months by the time April rolls around. So some of the specialty things that might take a little more time are harvesting honey. And there's a lot of different ways to do this, to lumping it all into one weekend, or you can harvest little bits of honey throughout the season, depending on what works best for your schedule. So if you're gonna wait until you have a lot of honey to harvest it all at once, it's kind of a weekend chore. So, and by a lot of honey, I mean 1 to 2 of these boxes are completely filled with harvestable honey. So that would be up to about 100 pounds of honey to harvest. And so what that would look like is it's not a whole weekend of your time because it takes a little bit of time for honey to drip off of things. So Saturday morning, you might go into your beehive and take out the honey. So that would take an hour or 2 to sweep your bees off into your beehive, bring your honey indoors. Then it would take another 1 to 2 hours to uncap the honey. So using some specialty honey processing equipment, you would open up the comb, spin it out of the comb, and then let it drip. And that's the point where I usually wait. So until Saturday evening or even Sunday morning, I kind of tilt all of my equipment so the honey drips down the sides, pools, is going through a strainer to get out any little wax bits. And then Sunday can be your bottling day. So you can put it all in jars. So it's kind of like a half day on Saturday and then some waiting time to let all of the honey drip down and really accumulate. And then Sunday, probably another half day to bottle your honey and to clean all of your equipment. So book out a weekend for something like that. If you're harvesting honey slowly throughout the season, you could probably take 1 frame out, and if you're just maybe taking a spoonful of the comb and eating it like that, or doing the crush and strain method, you can smash that honeycomb into a strainer, and then it's not really a big deal to clean up after that or put that back into the hive. So that's something that during your inspections, you could take out 1 frame of honey at a time and not have a big weekend harvesting party. But for my hives, I usually do, for just 2 hives in my backyard, I do 2 weekends a year for harvesting. And that kind of minimizes the amount of time that my kitchen is a sticky honey mess to disturb my family. But if you're only doing it twice a year, it's usually a novelty and something that your friends or neighbors want to come check out and see. So it can be a lot of fun. Next is, how much is beekeeping going to cost? And this is variable, so I'll give you kind of a range. To get started, I would ballpark about $500. And that would cover something like buying your beehive pieces, so all of the hive bodies, all of the frames that are inside. It would cover buying your bees, which usually cost in the ballpark of $100, $150. And it would cover all of my beekeeping gear, so my suit, my tools, my smoker, all of that stuff. So ballpark $500. Of course, you could spend more. So some people who want to start out with a little bit more of an established beehive, you can buy a nucleus colony, and those are more expensive. So I would tack on an extra $100 to $150 if you want to start out with a slightly more established hive. Or if you want some cute equipment, like I have these fancy kind of peaked copper top roofs because they look really nice in my yard. They're a little pricier than just a typical flat cover for my beehives. So you can definitely spend some more money that way. Or I also have a pretty fancy suit that helps keep me cool in the summer because I have more than just these 2 beehives. I have about 30 hives in this local area, so I spend a lot of time in my bee suit. So I have upgraded some of my equipment over the years. If you're not quite so sure, there's definitely some ways that you can spend a little bit less money. So instead of having a really, really fancy bee suit, you could use a veil. So that just takes a brimmed hat and is some netting that comes over you. So there's definitely some wiggle room in that $500, but $500 is a good ballpark estimate to what you're going to spend your first year. And then I highly recommend joining a local beekeeping club because oftentimes they will let you borrow specialty equipment. So the equipment you'll need to harvest your honey, a basic setup could cost another $500, $600 up to thousands of more dollars. But many local beekeeping clubs will let you borrow that equipment for just the cost of membership. So for a $35 fee, they will let you borrow thousands of dollars of equipment. So it's well worth it to, in your first year, to try to check out some of that other equipment before you commit and buy something that might not be quite right for you, or spend a lot of money on a hobby that maybe you end up not liking as much. So definitely join your local beekeeping club to get some local advice. So next is, can I legally keep these critters in my yard? And that's kind of a tricky question because every city tends to have different beekeeping laws. With the amount that beekeeping has been in the press in the last decade or so, a lot of these laws have been relaxed so that it is pretty easy to keep urban beehives. So if you want to find out the laws in your local area, I would search your city name, municipal code. And here in the Bay Area, most of those are searchable, so you can find certain keywords in the municipal code. So I usually go through searching for things like bees, beekeeping, apiary. So anything, those are the 3 main ones that usually it'll pop up some sort of any restrictions. And most of the restrictions that you would run up against would be you might have to have a setback. So some places say you have to keep bees X number of feet from your property line. So here in Alameda, we don't have actually any laws about beekeeping. So I can keep my bees right up against my property line, but they do fall under nuisance law. So I have a solid wooden fence, and there's actually a tree right above on my neighbor's side of the property where the bees can kind of like whoop, and they stay more on my side of the yard. So when I first moved these beehives here, my neighbors were like, oh, hey, we heard you had bees. Like, when are you going to move them in? And I was like, they've been here for weeks. And my neighbors didn't notice. If this was an open fence, so like kind of a chain link or had some open mesh, and I was just pointing my bees straight into my neighbor's yard, my neighbors probably aren't going to be too happy, and that would fall under nuisance law because I am disturbing my neighbor's enjoyment of their own property. Additionally, if my neighbors had a pool and I wasn't providing a water source and all my bees end up in their pool every summer, that could be something they could call the city and say, hey, my neighbor's not being very neighborly. So there's definitely like nuisance law is the bare minimum. So if you don't find any laws regarding beekeeping, likely you fall under nuisance law. But you can always double check. Again, your local beekeeping club likely has some better ideas about this, so you can contact them and see on a city by city basis what the local laws are. In some cities, beekeeping is illegal or nearly illegal based on those setbacks. So they might have, you have to be 100 feet from a public road, which can be very challenging in denser suburban areas with smaller lots. So definitely make sure to check those setbacks and make sure that you're keeping your bees on the up and up. You'll also have to register your bees. So many hobby beekeepers don't know about this. So this is a fairly new law in California about registering bees with your county. And there's a really easy website to do this. So if you have bees, just pop on Beware and you can register your hives online. Some counties require that you pay a nominal annual fee, like $10, but many counties waive that if you have very few beehives. So if you've got just 2 beehives in your backyard, a lot of counties will say, don't worry about it. Hopefully that answers all of your questions about should I get a beehive. If I didn't answer your question, leave me a comment down below, and hopefully I'll see you next time on the farm. Bye.